Picture the moment she realizes her power. She's barely 20 years old, standing in the marble halls of the imperial palace, and she understands something that took other rulers decades to grasp. That sex isn't weakness. Sex is leverage. Sex is infrastructure. Sex is how you break people. It's 41 AD, and Rome just watched its emperor Caligula get torn apart by his own guards. His successor, the man now beside her, is Claudius, a nervous, aging emperor with visible disabilities, selected almost by accident, desperate to consolidate power. And into this chaos steps Valeria Messalina. History remembers her as the most sexually insatiable woman Rome ever produced. But that's propaganda, written by men she destroyed. The truth is far more disturbing. She wasn't driven by desire. She was driven by calculation. And over the next 7 years, she would build something unprecedented, a system of sexual control so sophisticated that it would give her dominion over an empire of 60 million people. It didn't begin with scandal. It began with observation. Messalina watched how power worked in Rome. She watched senators make decisions based on fear. She watched women disappear into silence after their reputations were destroyed. She watched how information, knowing what powerful men did in private, what they wanted, what they were ashamed of, became more valuable than armies. By the time she became empress, she already knew exactly how to weaponize intimacy. The turning point came around 44 AD, just 3 years into her marriage. A powerful senator named Valerius Asiaticus owned property Messalina wanted, the gardens of Lucullus, perhaps the most beautiful estate in Rome. But Asiaticus wasn't someone she could simply order around. He had connections, influence, respect, so she constructed something more elegant. She orchestrated rumors that Asiaticus was having an affair with a beautiful woman named Poppaea, a woman Messalina had deliberately chosen because she knew Poppaea had caught the eye of someone Messalina herself desired. The genius of this wasn't the affair. It was that by destroying Asiaticus, she could claim Poppaea, and through Poppaea, she could access the man she actually wanted. She whispered the rumors into her husband's ear with such delicate precision that by the time Claudius made his decision, it felt like his own idea. Asiaticus was arrested. He was executed. The gardens of Lucullus became Messalina's property, and Poppaea? She was imprisoned and tortured until she took her own life. This was the system she was building. Not crude force, but choreographed destruction. Not obvious blackmail, but perfectly orchestrated ruin. What makes this especially disturbing is how Messalina systematically scaled the operation. Having proved the concept with Asiaticus, she began looking at Rome's entire power structure as a network of vulnerabilities. Every senator had a wife. Every general had a weakness. Every merchant who wanted to do business with the empire had desires he wanted to hide. So she constructed what later historians would call the palace brothel, though that term doesn't quite capture the horror of what it actually was. While Claudius was away, traveling to Britain for military campaigns, conducting business in the provinces, she would invite Rome's most powerful women to the imperial palace. These weren't ordinary invitations. These were summons wrapped in flattery, in suggestions of imperial favor, in barely veiled threats. Come celebrate with the empress, they were told. Come participate in imperial entertainment. What woman would dare refuse? What senator's wife would say no to an invitation from the throne itself? But once these women arrived, the nature of the entertainment became clear. They were placed in rooms decorated like a lupanar, a brothel. They were stripped naked, and then paying clients, wealthy merchants, ambitious senators, visiting foreign dignitaries, were brought in, one after another, to use their bodies. The women couldn't refuse. They couldn't resist, because every single one of them understood the implicit threat: comply or be destroyed. Refuse, Messalina, and your husband loses his position. Your children lose their inheritance. Your entire family becomes untouchable, pariahs in Roman society. Compliance, on the other hand, brought rewards, government contracts, military commissions, access to power. The documentation of this system is what makes it genuinely terrifying. Messalina didn't hide what was happening. She recorded it. There were archives, ledgers, lists. Who slept with whom? How many times? What was said in those private moments? What secrets emerged? What leverage could be used? The Roman historian Cassius Dio describes the system with clinical precision. Messalina would personally direct the men as they arrived, would sometimes watch or participate herself, and would ensure that every participant understood they were now permanently compromised. They could never speak against the throne. They could never challenge imperial decisions, because Messalina held their shame in those carefully maintained records, and one word from her and their families would know exactly what they had done. Consider the case of a man named Mnester, a famous dancer who had somehow avoided Messalina's net. He made the mistake of refusing her sexual advances at a public event. She complained to Claudius, not that she desired him, but that he was being disrespectful, that he was disobeying imperial authority. Claudius, easily manipulated, ordered Mnester to obey his wife in all things. What that meant became clear when Messalina, now having the emperor's explicit permission, simply took what she wanted. Mnester was a talented man with a future ahead of him, but in a moment, through careful use of words and the leverage of Claudius's authority, Messalina transformed him from a respected artist into a sexual slave. And the cruelest part was that he couldn't even complain. How could he? To speak against Messalina would mean admitting he had been forced into sexual slavery by the empress. That shame, that humiliation, became his prison. But the truly diabolical aspect of Messalina's system was how it destroyed the social fabric. Imagine being a senator sitting in the forum, and across from you sits another senator whose wife you know is currently being prostituted in the imperial palace. You make eye contact, and you both know. You both understand that you're complicit. You both recognize that speaking about it means destroying yourself. So instead, you develop this strange silence. You smile. You conduct business as normal. You're bound to each other now, not by friendship or alliance, but by mutual humiliation. Messalina had created a society where every powerful man carried a secret, and the secret bound them to her. They competed to obey her not out of love or loyalty, but out of pure survival instinct. This is what separated Messalina from other despots. She didn't rule through fear of death. She ruled through knowledge. She understood that humans can survive the fear of dying, but they struggle against the fear of exposure, of humiliation, of their private selves becoming public. And she weaponized that understanding perfectly. The records suggest that Messalina personally participated in many of these encounters. But again, historians have gotten this wrong. They've described her as sexually insatiable, driven by lust. The ancient poet Juvenal famously wrote that Messalina would disguise herself in a blonde wig, a color associated with barbarians and prostitutes, and sneak into the lowest brothels at night to work as a common prostitute until the sun came up, exhausted but unsatisfied. Modern scholars debate whether this was literal or metaphorical, whether it actually happened or was propaganda by men trying to discredit her. But what's remarkable is how historians have focused on the sexual aspect and completely missed the strategic aspect. When Messalina went into the brothels, she wasn't there for pleasure. She was there gathering intelligence. She was learning what men wanted. She was discovering which senators were having affairs, which generals were spending money on certain types of women, which visiting dignitaries had specific and unusual desires. That information became her most valuable commodity. Back in the palace, she weaponized it. A senator who thought his secret affair was hidden suddenly found himself facing political consequences for something he'd never told anyone. A general received whispers that his weakness was known. A merchant discovered that his hidden preferences had somehow become known to his competitors. The system worked because Messalina had information they didn't know she possessed, and she deployed that information with surgical precision. The sexual competition of 44 AD is perhaps the moment that best illustrates her methodology. Historians describe it as Messalina and a common prostitute named Scylla engaging in an endurance contest to determine who could satisfy the most men in a single night. According to Pliny the Elder, who recorded the event, Messalina won decisively, taking on 25 men in a continuous session, while Scylla managed only 23. The historians all describe this as an act of sexual excess, of perverted desire. But consider an alternative interpretation. What if this wasn't about Messalina's appetite for sex? What if it was about dominance? What if she was publicly demonstrating that even a professional prostitute, a woman trained from childhood to endure male sexuality, couldn't compete with an empress? That the most powerful woman in Rome could outperform a woman whose entire life was sexual servitude? The competition itself becomes a demonstration of control. Every man involved knew what he was participating in. Every witness understood the message. Messalina controls this. Not just this moment, but all sexuality in Rome now belongs to her. She decides who gets access. She decides the rules. She decides what is permissible and what is forbidden. If she can outperform professionals, then what hope do ordinary women have of resisting her? What hope do the men who use them have? The political message embedded in that single night was staggering in its implications. By the year 48 AD, Messalina had consolidated power so completely that she essentially controlled the empire from behind the throne. Claudius was the figurehead, but she was the architect. She decided who would advance and who would fall. She controlled the Senate through blackmail. She controlled the military through strategic distributions of favor and threats. She controlled the merchant class through the promise of contracts or economic destruction. And she had built this empire not through armies, but through sex, through systematic documentation of sexual encounters, through the weaponization of shame and humiliation, through the transformation of intimacy into infrastructure. The beauty of the system, from her perspective, was that it was almost impossible to challenge. Anyone who tried to expose it would be admitting to their own participation. Anyone who complained would be revealing their own blackmail. The system sustained itself through its own secret. But in 48 AD, Messalina made her first and only recorded strategic mistake. A senator named Gaius Silius, handsome and ambitious, caught her attention. And instead of simply adding him to her network of compromised men, she fell into something different. She became obsessed. She gave him gifts from the imperial treasury. She gave him the house and property she'd seized from Asiaticus. She elevated him to consul. And then, in an act that shocked even her closest allies, she divorced Claudius and married Gaius Silius in a public ceremony. Historians debate whether this was a serious coup attempt or a ritual wedding during a Bacchic festival that got out of hand. But the political significance is undeniable. by marrying Silius publicly, by announcing it to the city, Messalina was no longer ruling from the shadows. She was no longer working through Claudius. She was openly asserting power. She was declaring that the system she'd built was no longer about hidden leverage. It was about open domination. And in doing that, she crossed a line her allies couldn't tolerate. When the news reached Claudius in Ostia, delivered by his favorite mistresses, who rushed to tell him that his wife had just married another man, he initially panicked. But his advisors understood what Messalina apparently didn't, that the network she'd built through sexual blackmail couldn't save her when the threat became existential. Yes, Claudius loved her. Yes, Claudius was manipulated by her. But she'd also built her power by compromising every powerful person in Rome. And when that network faced a choice between protecting Messalina or protecting their own secrets, they chose their secrets. They convinced Claudius that Messalina and Silius were attempting a coup. Whether this was true or exaggerated is debatable, but the resulting response was swift and brutal. Executioners were sent to Messalina. She was killed in the imperial gardens, abandoned by everyone she'd ever controlled. And then Rome attempted the ultimate erasure. The Senate voted for damnatio memoriae, an attempt to completely erase Messalina from history. Her statues were destroyed. Her name was struck from records. Officials pretended she'd never existed. The empire was trying to collectively forget her, but forgetting didn't work. Instead, what emerged was a different kind of historical memory, one that emphasized her sexual excess while erasing her political genius. Juvenal, writing a generation later, described her as the imperial whore, fixing her reputation for centuries as a woman driven by uncontrollable lust rather than uncontrollable ambition. Later, historians picked up this narrative and elaborated on it. She became a punchline, a symbol of female depravity rather than female power. And in doing that, Rome successfully buried her real threat. Because the truth about Messalina is far more dangerous than any story about sexual excess. The truth is that she proved something Rome didn't want to acknowledge, that power doesn't require armies if you understand human psychology. Power doesn't require violence if you understand shame. Power doesn't require legitimacy if you understand leverage. And once Messalina had shown that a single woman could control an empire of 60 million people simply by systematically exploiting sexuality and carefully documenting it, the very possibility became terrifying. In the end, what happened in Rome under Messalina was this. She didn't just have affairs or fulfill some perverted fantasy. She constructed an entire parallel government based on sexual surveillance, sexual coercion, and the weaponization of private shame for public control. She demonstrated that the most powerful tool available isn't force, it's knowledge of what people don't want known. She showed that control flows not from the throne, but from the bedroom, from the intimate moments where people reveal who they really are and what they actually desire. And she did this so effectively that an entire empire became a single, interconnected web of complicity, where every powerful person was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, compromised and controlling, silenced by their own participation in the system. The empire built by Augustus through military might, the succession systems refined by Tiberius through political intrigue, all of it became subordinate to something simpler and more total. The empire built by Messalina through the systematic exploitation of sex and shame. And the most remarkable part is how completely history forgot this. We remember her as a sexual deviant rather than a political genius. We treat her system as an aberration rather than as a refined demonstration of how power actually works when all other constraints are removed. That forgetting might be the greatest mercy Rome ever granted her, because if people truly understood what she accomplished, if they truly recognized that an entire empire could be controlled through the weaponization of sexuality and shame, that knowledge would be far more threatening than any story about an insatiable empress. It would suggest that power is far more fragile than we'd like to believe, and far easier to seize than we'd care to admit, if you're willing to use the tools Messalina used. And that's the final, uncomfortable truth about her story. It wasn't unique to Rome. The system she built isn't ancient history. It's simply power, in one of its truest forms. And recognizing that might be the most important lesson her story has to teach.